So just a way for us to kind of go over what we discussed and kind of like reinforce knowledge also. Repetition brings reinforcement. So you repeat stuff, it sticks more. Started our conversation around Azure, the Azure Administrator course. Mentioned that there are certain things that I call Azure Foundations that I think that you have to understand those foundations if everything else will make sense in Azure. So I mentioned that they're mainly four parts. And again, this is something that's evolving. As I interact with delegates all the time in the community, I pick up certain things that I go, that's something that's important. If we can cover this as part of the foundations, people won't have this issue. So one of them, the one that I found to be called is the Azure Global Infrastructure. And number two is the Azure Resource Hierarchy. Number three is Azure Management Tools. Number four is Azure Resource Manager. Or HAM. So what I'll consider to be the Azure Foundations, getting a strong grasp of these four main areas, I think gives anybody a very good start to understanding many other things in Azure. So when we started discussing Azure Global Infrastructure, we're talking about, so we have to understand the concept of geography. Does anyone want to remind us what geographies are in your own word? So how would you describe an Azure geography?
Countries.
Countries? Is it?
Data residency and the compliance boundary.
That's it. So
Correct, sorry.
yeah, no problem. So here's one interesting thing about geography is that you could. So thanks very much for that answer. That's absolutely accurate. So data residency and compliance boundaries. And it's very important because mentioned countries, but actually that within a single country you can have multiple geographies. There could be multiple geographies within a single country. You say, David, how is that possible? Right? Does anybody wants to guess how that's possible? How could we have multiple geographies within a single country? How is that possible?
No, it's just locations, isn't it?
I mean, it's within a single country. I mean, do they have different, how is that possible?
You've got the government section as well as the non-government section.
Excellent. That's the key. So because if I go to that document that I showed you, geographies, and you look at the geographies, you see that there's United States, you see that there's Canada, there's Brazil, but then you also notice that there's something called Azure Government. And that is specifically not referring to government of the world. That's specifically referring to US government. So United States public, that's a separate geography. The United States government is a separate geography within the United States. Why? Because for the United States government, they have a different data residency and compliance requirements that they have to follow that's different from the rest of the United States public. So that's why, so when you talk about geographies, it's what's the data residency and compliance requirement, what's the boundary, and that's what they use to term geographies. I think there's like a bit of background noise again. You say like we have the Europe, we have France, you have stuff. So for example, Europe, that's a continent. You've got France, but again, it's just different data residency and compliance boundaries and stuff. That's the main key about geography. So that's good. Okay. So geographies, data residency and compliance boundaries. Who wants to help us with understanding? So geography. Let's go for next one is regions. How would you describe a region? You can unmute yourself to answer. Feel free to.
Geographically separate location by 300 miles.
By 300 miles, yeah, I like that. So yeah, exactly. So just region is just, I'll call it a collection of availability zones,
data
within
centers in that area. Yeah.
yeah within a single within a geography. So and typically, like, how many regions would we have in a geography?
With two.
At least two. That's it. So at least two. So say collection of AZs, availability zones. Um, Minimum of two within a geography. That's the plan. Actually, for like United States, because that's a really large place. There's more than two regions. You see, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Actually, like there's some regions that got so busy that I started building number two. So there's East US, there's East US too. There's West US, there's West US too. So that's sort of like the way that it taught this with. So the idea is that a minimum of two. There's only one exception to that, and that's Brazil. Sad. That's the only exception to that. Brazil currently only has one region, the geography Brazil, the data residency and compliance boundary, only has one region, Brazil South. So when they're doing the region pair, that unfortunately they replicate to the US. So if anybody's deploying there, they've got to be okay with their data being replicated to the US. But that's the only exception for now. But you look at the others, it's a minimum of two regions in every geography that they've got. So minimum of two regions. And the whole idea is you can design for disaster recovery without breaking your data residency and compliance requirements. Excellent. So let's move on again. So the other thing that we discussed was availability zones. So how would you describe availability zones? Want to?
A group of data centers in the region.
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
3 groups of data centers per region.
Groups of what?
3 groups of data centers.
Of data centers. Excellent. That's it. That's the keyword. So, and I like the way you put it also. So it's group or groups of data centers. So it starts with geography. Geography is groups of regions. Regions are groups of availability zones. Availability zones are groups of data centers.
With
And
less than 2 millisecond response time between DC groups.
excellent, and that's the key. So 2 milliseconds, and that's guaranteed latency by Microsoft. So within a region, guaranteed latency is 2 milliseconds. So you're spread out across availability zones. So that's high speed, very low latency network connectivity within availability zones within a single region. And they're closer to one another. Groups of data centers that are closer to one another than regions that are greater than 300 miles apart. And that's talking about the targets, because that's not always achievable, but that's kind of like the ambition that Microsoft has with regards to that. 2 millisecond latency within the availability zone. Excellent. I think that's great. So then we talked about data centers. There really isn't much to discuss about data centers. They're just normal data centers, except they are like a massive scale. And I showed you yesterday around the shipping containers that they've modified, and that's how they scale. They don't scale server by server, they scale by thousands of servers by thousands of servers. They send shipping containers to scale. Actually, like the UK South region, they recently scaled a lot. Actually, by let me look for that news. Azure UK South, because I think they actually so they increased that I think by over 1,000% if I remember. Is the news. So Microsoft has doubled the size, and that was just in April, of UK Azure regions, increasing compute capacity by more than 1,500%. So I think there was an issue last year where people were having trouble deploying. Does anybody remember that? Anybody had any issues with that? Where people were having trouble deploying into UK regions because of availability of resources. Did anybody hear about that?
No.
Ah.
I think I did read about it. But
Yeah. So there was an issue sometime last year. So, and I think that maybe this was like one of the responses to it. So they doubled the size. It's more than 1,500% increase. So yeah, it's all good now. So we shouldn't get those issues again, hopefully. But again, that just shows how cloud adoption is growing rapidly across the region. Okay, so data centers, just data centers. That's what they are. And after data centers, we talked about availability sets. Okay, so availability set has two main concepts to it. So talk about the fault domain and update domain. Anybody wants to help us to remind us like what fault domain are, and another person can help us with update domains. So yeah,
Fault domain's like a rack. So if a
excellent.
rack goes, like, or the switch goes, or the power supply goes to a single rack.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. Thanks very much for that. Anyone else wants to help us with the update domain? Just again in your own words.
That's Microsoft update patterns. Just to
Excellent.
protect against that.
Or like firmware updates and stuff like that as well, I think.
Yes, exactly. That's correct. Both of those are correct. So that's the Hyper-VOs themselves, that's the network switches and stuff. So they group things into update domains, and that's how they update stuff. So the best practice with that is for every tier of your application. So let's say you have a 3-tier application where you have a web tier, maybe an application tier, and you have a data tier. What you want to do, number one, let me say what you don't want to do. You don't want a situation where you put, so this is, you have two web tier. What you don't want to do is to take like your data tier VMs and then put them in the same availability set as this one. What you want to do is you want to create separate, um, you want, like, actually, let me make this smaller. Yeah, it's better. What you want to do is you want to create separate availability set for the different tiers. So you have your web tier, they're in their own availability set. For your application tier, your middle tier, they're in a separate availability set. And the same for your data tier, they're in separate availability set. So that's what you want to do with that. You don't want to group everything into one. You want to go separate availability set, separate one, and separate one. So that's the whole plan behind that. And once you do that, essentially you're telling Microsoft, ensure that these VMs in this availability set don't end up on the same fault and update domain. Ensure that these ones don't end up on the same fault and update domain. Ensure that these ones don't end up in the same fault and update domains.
David, a
Yeah.
quick question related to that. I found the availability sets quite well, not confusing, but I just wanted to clarify.
Yes.
So when you specify for like your web tier,
Yeah.
an availability set, you put them in the same one to ensure they don't go on the same fault domain and update domain?
Yes, exactly.
Because
So
in my mind, I was thinking, I'll put it in one availability set and make sure the other one's on a different one.
no. So the way to think about it is kind of like this is your way. So once you put them in the same availability set, it's your way of telling Microsoft these two are providing the same service. Ensure they don't end up on the same fault and update domain.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
So that's kind of like I think on a previous call somebody described it as, if you're familiar with like VMware, what's it called? Where you can there's a concept where you
Affinity
can
rules.
sorry?
VMware affinity rules.
Exactly, that's it. Thanks very much for that. The affinity way, the affinity was where you can use to tell VMware to say ensure that these VMs don't end up on the same host. That sort of thing. So that's kind of like a similar, not exactly the same, but a similar concept of availability set. You put them in the same availability set means you don't want them on the same fault and update domains. Okay, so that's around that. The global infrastructure is around the different Azure clouds. Because the Azure cloud, there's three main ones that I'll say. So just to give you that new information that I just added to that. So we have what you call the Azure clouds. You have the Azure public regions. You have the Azure government, like we saw earlier, and we have the Azure geofenced regions. Yeah, so what I wanted to show you was in terms of, if I go to create a resource and just select anything, virtual machine or web app. If you look at the regions, I can select to deploy in any of these regions. But one of the things that you notice is that, of course, I cannot, I cannot select the government regions. So that's a separate portal. But one of the things also that you may have noticed if you're looking at this is, if we look at the list, if I go to Europe, there's North Europe, West Europe, Germany North, Germany West, Central. That's interesting. You go there, you can go, I can select um, West Europe, North Europe, and the others. But one of the things that you may notice is, for example, I can select Germany Central, I can select Germany Northeast. Why? Why can't I select that? Germany is one of those such regions that's geofenced because there's a stricter data residency and compliance requirement for Germany itself that's different from the rest of Europe. So that's a geofenced area where you have to have, so for example, you could go sign up to be able to deploy into Azure Germany. It's a separate sign-up process. It's a geofence process. As long as you have presence in Europe, you can sign up. So I've signed up for trial account for Azure Germany in the past to do some tests. So you can sign up as long as you have a presence in Europe and stuff like that. That's absolutely fine. But it's a geofence region. You know what? It's isolated from the rest of the Azure regions. So not everybody can just go sign into Azure or create an Azure subscription and all of a sudden start deploying there. It's a geofence region. Does anybody know the other geography that the other regions that also geofenced apart from Germany?
China.
That's it. It's China.
Mhm.
So China also it's geofenced. So again, it's a different Azure portal that I have to go into. So portal.azure.cn, I believe. And then when you go there, it's a separate sign-up process, and then you'll be able to deploy only to the Azure China regions. When you sign into that particular subscription or that particular account, you only be able to deploy into those Azure regions. So again, that's just to give you a quick understanding of those. In terms of the Azure cloud, we have the Azure Public, which is the one that the rest of us are using. You have the Azure Government, which for US government, and you have to be vetted by the US government to even get access. And Azure Geofenced, which are mainly Azure Germany and Azure China. Okay, so when we continue the conversation, we started talking about Azure Resource Hierarchy. We talked about Azure subscriptions, and we talked about Azure Resource Groups, and we talked about Azure Resources, and we talked about management groups. So true or false, resource groups are containers for Azure resources.
False.
False.
Excellent, that's good. That's good. So if they are not containers for Azure resources, what are they containers for?
Metadata.
Yeah, the container is excellent. That's containers for resource metadata. So that will help to clear up confusion about why you can have a resource in this region and the resource group in a separate region somewhere else. And you're like, yeah, I'm deploying this resource here, but the resource group over there. It's just a management construct and stuff like that. So Azure subscriptions. How would you describe Azure subscriptions? Any, just in your own words?
Administrative groupings.
Payment account stuff.
Payment.
Yeah, so that's it. So it's a payment account. That's essentially what it is. It's just a payment account. So, and then whenever you deploy your resources, you can specify which payment account you, you want it to be charged to, essentially. There are different options. So we mentioned yesterday, you have like the partner options. You can have things like the pay-as-you-go options. You have the CSP option, and then you have the enterprise agreement option. And the main difference is you get better discounts with this. This requires a relationship with a partner. This requires an agreement with Microsoft where you commit to a certain Azure spend over a period of time. It has benefit of things like price protection. You get your enterprise, your EA portal, they call it ea.azure.com. Yeah, so that's ea.azure.com. So this is a separate Microsoft Azure Enterprise portal. So once you have the agreement with Microsoft, they give you access to this portal where you can add certain accounts to get access to this portal. And then what you can do is you can create subscriptions. So, and that's linked to like your organizational agreement with Microsoft. We've agreed to spend 700K this year. Therefore, you can create as much subscriptions, and they're all tied into that. So, it's a very nice thing that you get as if you're a large enterprise, you get this and makes things much more easier in creating subscriptions and all that stuff. Resources we mentioned, they are just services in Azure, and there are lots of them, hundreds of them. So what about management groups? What are management groups? So I think we'll move on after this one.
Tool to group multiple subscriptions.
Yeah. So exactly. So it's kind of like a way to group your subscriptions together. So it's something that's new. So if I want to start using management groups, there's two main things that I need to do.
You gotta have someone as an admin.
Yeah. So that's step number 2. Well, step number 1 is
Creating a local management group.
yeah, you set up the root management group to begin with. So management group
And then a child group.
oh yeah, exactly. So a root group and a child group, and then after that, then you have to ensure that somebody, at least one person, has access to the root management group. Otherwise, you won't be able to do anything with it. So by default, management groups are not enabled. So number 1, you first have to enable it. That's the number 1 thing you have to do. Enable it first. Then number 2 thing that you need to do is you need to add access to the root management group. And we'll cover this in much more details, not necessarily this itself, but we'll talk about how we can use this to establish governance when we